Good afternoon, obviously. So we're in lesson 4 this afternoon, I should say, in part 3 of what serves as the kind of historical introductory mini-series on the world of the New Testament. And so we're in the third and final portion of that. Obviously, last 2 weeks have been us exploring the historic Jewish background leading up and into the first century, going back to, for us, the rise of Cyrus the Great, the Shahanshah, or the King of Kings of Persia, and detailing that. Last week we examined the historical origins and the background of the Romans, going all the way back to the Aeneid by Virgil and his accounting of Aeneas, coming from the Trojan War and migrating all around the Mediterranean, exploring and adventuring, and then eventually settling down in Latinium, or in the land of the Latins, and the descent through Romulus and Remus, and the whole origin of the legend and the mythos of the Roman society, and particularly that of its emperors. Here, this is now part 3, and we are specifically focusing on what did this Greco-Roman civilization, what did this civilization that ruled the world look like by the time we get to the 1st century AD. So it's not an extensive study of these things, because we could just spend months and months on the various things that we're going to cover this morning this afternoon in one lesson. And so it's the glossary version very much, giving you a general oversight of what exactly this civilization in which we see the arrival of Christ and the birth of the church occur in. Okay? So, on that particular note, our exploration of the Greco-Roman world. Now, we covered this in part in previous weeks, and I'll just remind you of what we touched on. The concept of the Greco-Roman world, it describes the period of late antiquity, so the late ancient world, it is to say, that was culturally and historically shaped by the civilization of the ancient Greeks and Romans. And we're going to see that in very obvious and overt detail this afternoon as we go through the class. This came about, to refresh your memories, through the conquest of the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great, where he conquered all of the former Persian Empire and even territories beyond Persia, thereby spreading Greek culture around the eastern portions of the world particularly. This, of course, continued to flourish through what's called the Hellenistic period, which we'll reference later as well. Following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and the establishment of the Diadochi, right, or the successor kingdoms, those 4 successor kingdoms that we'd referenced in weeks past that succeeded Alexander and had the Hellenistic, that is to say Greek culture, be the predominant culture of the world for 300 years before we then eventually get to the Roman period. Through that time, the Roman Republic, as it was then, is conquering vast territories around the Mediterranean world. They, of course, then roll through and conquer the various Greek kingdoms, and this runs all the way through to what is the end of that Hellenistic period, which is the victory of then Octavian, the one who we call Augustus, the first emperor, over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, during what's called the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and this is the end of that last successor Greek kingdom called the Ptolemaic kingdom, which ruled Egypt, and Cleopatra was the last pharaoh thereof. So that's the Greco-Roman world. It's the civilization that came to rule the world by the time we get to the 1st century and the time of Christ and of the apostles. So this morning, what we're specifically going to be kind of touching on or highlighting is these various common factors that made up the Greco-Roman world. So there was a common political system, the common economy, the common language, the common culture, and the common religion. And you'll see there that not only on the screen but in your handout, your study guide there as well, the notes that the common religion was the amalgamation or the unification of 3 particular kind of pillars, so to speak, the proverbial 3 legs of the stool. The philosophical religions, the mystical religions, aka the mystery religions, the mystery cults, and the civic religion, which itself was formed of 2 parts, which we'll address later on. Okay, and so what we'll do is we're going to go through these specific sections and get the highlight package of what these various areas looked like during the golden age of the Roman Empire and this age in which Christ came. So, by the time we get to the 1st century AD, we have a time where, as we've seen in weeks past, particularly last week, Rome has now evolved into an empire. Okay? The definition of that empire is and what it looks like on paper is different than what it looks like in the public perception. And even then, the public perception, depending on who you talk to, would sometimes be different. That is to say, it's complex, and that is to say that it requires a lot of explanation as to what that was. The simplest possible way that I can encapsulate that thought is, on paper, when we think of an empire, we think of a monarchical figure, right? So a kingly figure who's ruling over other kings, right? We use that term emperor in English specifically and exclusively for a king who's conquered and is now reigning over other kings, okay? So a king of kings is what an emperor is, right? It's the highest monarchical title in the world, right? We obviously call the Roman Empire, and it's fine and it is accurate that we call it that. But it is worth pointing out and noting that in the days of the Roman Empire, Rome was not an empire as far as they were concerned. Rome was still, on paper, a republic, even though they have a singular autocratic figure who is adored as a descendant of the gods, who is honoured and who is expected to uphold the religious mores and customs of the Roman state, who is seen as the very embodiment of the Roman state, and who then often, albeit not always, but often posthumously, that is to say after death, would be deified, okay? Who had temples built in their name, yet were not kings, right? It's this odd dichotomy of the fact that you can pretend you're a republic all you want, but if you are structured and operate like an empire, you're an empire, okay? Even with the cursory kind of summary of a study that we're doing this morning, you may or may not, depending on your geopolitical knowledge, be able to see many of the commonalities between the Roman Empire and the modern day American Republic. That part aside. Nevertheless, what had developed by that point was the Roman state, in this case what we would call an imperial state, that was built upon basically three kind of foundations in regards to what that government looked like. Okay, you had the central government, right, the central Roman state, which was built upon the foundation of the emperor and the Senate. Okay, so even during the days, half my point is there, even during the days when Rome was an empire and the emperor was the most powerful man that had ever walked the face of the earth, the Senate still existed, and the Senate still did plenty of things. You didn't have Rome without the Senate. Again, the way that the Romans referred to themselves is a Latin phrase, senatus populus Romanus, right? The Senate and the people of Rome, right? The SPQR, that's how they refer to themselves. So if in terms of what was the official name of Rome in terms of the common usage, like we would say the Commonwealth of Australia or the United States of America, right? The Senate and the people of Rome. Okay, so the Senate and the people. See this republican basically presentation or figuring, which is what it had been for 500 years. Augustus was positing himself basically as being the restorer of the republic. Okay, more on that later. So you had the central government built on, sort of centered upon the emperor and the Senate. You then had the military, which was not just merely, this nice, objective, apolitical organisation. It was anything but apolitical, and it was anything but objective. It was a governmental power pretty much in its own right. And then you had the various provincial governments around the empire. Again, especially during the days prior to the internet and Wi-Fi and satellites and GPS and everything else in between, managing an empire of millions of square kilometres around the world does not present a terribly easy logistical environment. You need, by definition, the cooperation of the conquered peoples. You need the cooperation of the governments or the governmental systems that you've just conquered. Right? So this is what I mean by provincial governments. Right? So the Sanhedrin, right, the Jewish leadership in Judea, that's a form of provincial government. Okay, so we've seen obviously that in previous weeks with the Herodian kingdom and how they were tied at the hip to Rome. The fact that the Herodian kingdom existed because Herod the Great was crowned by the Roman Senate. Okay, this is how this works, right? So the central government or the central state, emperor and senate, the military, and the provincial governments, and these were all kept in union with each other. Very tepidly and often very shakily and uncertainly, with plenty of chaos in between. This is the simple explanation of what we have in regards to that particular foundation of the political system. Throughout history, what you end up finding in regards specifically of just referring to the emperors themselves is they assume unto themselves at different times and in different ways to different degrees numerous titles and offices and positions. Okay, I'm using those terms kind of interchangeably. We're going to have, you see on your study notes there, I'm just going to go through 6 of them. There are a lot more than just this, but these are the 6 kind of important ones that will give you a good framework of not only how the emperors were positioned in terms of their rank and what they actually functionally did, but also, more importantly for us, how were they viewed, right? How were the emperors understood to be, and how were the emperors viewed? Because then that's where the intersection for us is when it comes to reading the scriptures or understanding the history of the church in the Roman period, right? And the kind of common social consensus as to what things were, right? So the first one there is Augustus. Augustus is, again, so you've heard me refer to the first Roman emperor as Augustus. And we explained in previous weeks, I forget which one it was, that that's not his original name, right? We referred to him before 27 BC, before he was not crowned, because again, they weren't kings, but before he was basically granted the title by the Senate of Augustus, he was called Octavian. Okay, so this is the one who we've referenced from before. We've seen statues of him. This is the one who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Now again, for clarification, I've said it before, but I'll mention it again. I'm referring to Augustus as the first emperor insofar as we on paper look back on it. In practical terms, how was it viewed in the day Julius Caesar was the first emperor? Okay, would he have been called the emperor? No, not necessarily, because imperator, which is down the bottom of the screen there, the third title, we'll talk about that in a minute, right? But Julius Caesar was the beginning of all of this. Okay, the only reason why Augustus was able to consolidate power, defeat the enemies in the civil war, and be esteemed as he was because he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Okay, so Julius Caesar was widely considered to be the first. There was differences of opinion in the first century, but we get a lot of information from the Roman scholars and historians and philosophers of that day that clearly indicate to us that Julius Caesar was held to be the first of the emperors, right? This is not just merely tidbits of history trivia, right? This impacts how we understand things in the Gospels. It informs how we understand things in the book of Revelation, etc. But Augustus is a title, as a Latin word means the majestic or the venerable, the great. It's an honorific title that was exclusively used for the emperors, and so that's why Augustus was proclaimed as such by the Roman Senate, and why emperors after him retained the epithet or the title of Augustus, because it was very much a title. Okay, it also, by extension, would become. It had, not in the literal translation of the word, obviously, but it had kind of within its semantic domain or its semantic range an association with the concept of divinity. Okay, and that it aids and impacts how the emperors were viewed. Second one there is Caesar, right? Caesar again is originally the cognomen of Julius Caesar, of Gaius Julius Caesar. So Gaius, his first name, of the gens Julia, or the Julian clan, and he was of the particular branch or family known as the Caesarians. Okay, Caesar, right? Hence where that comes from. So Caesar was obviously then adopted by Augustus. So he was often at one point known as Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus. right, or Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian. And as an adopted son, he also adopted that name as well. So Caesar then became, from Augustus and by extension Julius Caesar, basically a catch-all epithet, and it then itself became a title for the Roman emperors, right? So when we see Caesar appearing in the Gospels, for example, or in the book of Acts, it's because of the continuation of Caesar as an imperial title for those emperors, again showing their connection to Julius Caesar as adopted sons of adopted sons of adopted sons of this Julio-Claudian dynasty. And so it's giving them legitimacy to the throne, not that it was a throne, but to the imperial seat. Third one there is imperator. This is where we get the English word emperor. Okay, so imperator and how they were referred to, and again, this is my whole point about them not on paper, inverted commas, being kings, is imperator is a military title. Right, so the word that we use for emperor in English, which we think of in monarchical terms, the original word imperator had nothing to do with kings. It was a military term, and it was what's called a victory title. We don't have time to go into the very fascinating history of the term imperator and what it means to hold imperium, as it was called. But long story short, the very simplified explanation is it was tied to, usually a high-ranking military commander, kind of what we can, in our modern English, think of as like a general, okay, who after, a massive military victory would be honoured with basically Rome's most sacred ceremony called a triumph, right, or a triumph, which is where we get that English word triumph. It's just a straight rendering from the Latin. The triumph was as close to a king and indeed a god as a Roman man would be made in the days of the Roman Republic. Okay, so this wasn't in the days of the Empire, this went all the way back into the Republic. And basically during a triumph, simplifying a lot of details here, the successful general who's had a massive victory over Rome's enemies would be granted right to enter into Rome as a military general, because that was illegal, right, in order to ensure that the military was to operate on foreign soil, and it was illegal to operate on domestic Roman soil. But he would be granted rights to enter the city, kind of like giving keys to the city like we have in our days with military honours. He would be dressed in purple and it would often be colloquially referred to as ascending to the purple, right? Purple being the colour of royalty, because of how rare and expensive it is to make purple in the ancient world. Gilded with gold adornments all over. There's evidence that he would be painted, some evidence that he would have his face painted red in the style of Mars, the god of war, and he would then be adorned in a very sacred ceremony, usually before or in front of the temple of Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with a laurel wreath, right? So like a laurel wreath, going back into Greek context as well, symbolising a crown, right? Laurel wreaths were given to Olympic victors, right? Athletes who were successful at the Olympic Games or the Isthmian Games, the Delphian Games, so on. And so this sign of victory, but as a crown. So effectively, this general was being treated as a king for a day. He'd ride in through the city, through the Roman Forum, on a 4-horse chariot, which is, again, the gods are the ones who ride 4-horse chariots. And it's also where we have this famous, accounting for us in history of, amidst all of that, and again, this desire for them to not be kings, but sort of kind of, usually we have evidence that often they would then have either an associate or a friend or one of their slaves riding on the chariot, actually like right next to them with them, whispering in their ear a Latin phrase that we often encapsulate as memento mori, right? Which means remember your death. It was meant to humble the general, that while he's being adored by the people of Rome practically as a king and borderline god for his great military might and victory over Rome's enemies, a slave would be whispering in his ear, remember that you are mortal, remember that you will one day die. Very interesting. Even amidst this borderline kingly and godly celebration, there's still this underlying expectation of groundedness and humility. It's a fascinating dichotomy, but nonetheless, imperator is a military title and was retained through as descriptors of them being the leaders or basically the commander-in-chief of the military. The other three are relatively more simple. Again, we'll cover those more in detail later on. But the Pontifex Maximus, which means the chief priest or the head priest. If any of these titles, you're probably more familiar with this maybe than others if you have come from a Roman Catholic context, by virtue of the fact that for approximately, I'm using round figures, approximately the last 500 years, the Bishop of Rome has adopted the title of Pontifex Maximus. He was the head of the College of Pontiffs, right, or the head of the College of Priests. That's why the Roman Church has what is the approximate equation of that, which is the College of Cardinals. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, their supreme pontiff, was basically in charge of the public religion of the Romans. Okay, this was the high priest of Roman religion in simple terms. And at times, again, so the emperors were actually appointed as the Pontifex Maximus. So it's this unity between the political and the religious that are inseparable in this relationship. The other is princeps, sometimes more fully referred to as princeps senatus, which means first, right? So princeps is where we get the English word prince, right? As in a prince, right? The son of a king. Princeps literally just means first. And this is where they were considered the first citizen, right? The first among equals, to use another Roman or Latin term, primus inter pares. But the princeps was considered the first citizen, right? The citizen that was to take the lead and make sure that the state was maintained. It was commonly used by the emperors because it was an official position of princeps, along with other ones like consul and consul and so on. But it was then adopted by the Roman emperors essentially as part of that overall propagandistic effort to maintain the facade of this, basically the restored republic, right? So that was the image that the republic hadn't ended. Caesar and then Augustus after him had basically restored the republic, even though that's very clearly not how God presents it in the scriptures. It was very much not a republic. And the last one there is Dominus, which is simply the Latin term for Lord or Master. Again, so Christ is, if you the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Greek New Testament, obviously utilises the term Dominus, often in relation to Christ. It's an honorific title, very popular during the later portions of the imperial period. So we actually divide the Roman Empire in terms of government into the Principate and the Dominate, which just describes the two major portions of the empire. But it comes up in terms of, for us, it comes up in the Greek form Kaiser Kyrios, right, which means Caesar is Lord. Kyrios is the Greek equivalent of the Latin Dominus. Okay, so in Latin it would be Caesar Dominus, right? Caesar is Lord. This is why, in part, we don't have time to go in today, a number of the references you find in the New Testament, particularly utilised by Paul, are not actually original to Paul. You find a number of times where Paul, on more than one occasion, will actually use Roman propaganda from the day, but basically revamp it or redo it in application to Christ. One such example would be, all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That was a known Roman statement, that all who call upon the name of Caesar will be saved. Okay, there's more than one occasion of that occurring in the New Testament, of Paul basically, and others, but Paul particularly, reappropriating and flipping on its head Roman imperial propaganda in application to Christ as the true Lord. Not just as merely like a ruler, but Lord, especially in a divine sense. So that's a simple enough explanation of what this common political system is, unified under the emperor and the Senate, but spearheaded under this central autocratic figure that was the imperial seat, okay, and the emperors therefrom. So next is going to be the common economy. What we find here is that one of the most elaborate and impressive economic institutions and settings and systems that the world has, quite frankly, ever seen up until the modern industrial period. Major cities across the empire, of course, as Rome has conquered the Mediterranean world, you have major historic cities all around. Of course, other than Rome, you have Carthage, you have other major cities like Athens, cities like Alexandria in northern Egypt, which they conquered obviously after having conquered the Ptolemaic kingdom, so on and so forth. These various cities were now under the one unified emperor and senate of Rome. They were now connected in ways that they never had been before. Of course, commerce necessary to the vitally necessary to the everyday life of the people of Rome. They were no less economic than we are in our day. They were. We often think of ourselves as rather impressive because we have, next day shipping, and we have things that we can order online, and we can trade stocks in foreign stock exchanges and various other things, and so on and so forth. The imperial Roman economy was as connected for a time before the internet as you could possibly ever hope to get. Classic, coastal port cities like Alexandria that I mentioned before, as well as any kind of city that was accessible by major or navigable river like Rome, being a classic example, were able to be connected in ways that they never had been before. And this was primarily for two overarching reasons that were intimately tied together. One, the unprecedented and innovative construction of the Roman road network all around the world, as well as the ubiquitous and practically universal peace that was brought by the Roman navy upon the high seas of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and so on and so forth. You had road networks being built, very impressive, and not for this morning, not for this afternoon to show you obviously, but it'd be fascinating. You can go and look it up on YouTube and read various articles online of the incredible engineering feats of how Rome built these various roads and these road networks all around. And as I said, the peace came from the fact that the Roman navy ruled the high seas. They brought peace that essentially would not exist upon the high seas until the might of the British Navy and of His Majesty's Royal Navy would then bring about peace upon the high seas, particularly in the Atlantic. And then obviously, of course, in the modern day, since basically World War II, the peace upon the high seas that the United States Navy has brought in the almost virtual eradication of piracy, which is a historic feat on their part. These great, powerful navies, the Roman, the British, the American, have brought unprecedented peace on the high seas, because when you have any of them, but in this case for us, the Romans, when you have the Roman navy constantly patrolling the seas, and they're well armed, they have the best ships, and they have warriors and soldiers and sailors in this case that will die in a heartbeat for Rome, it makes piracy not all that attractive. There's various famous stories of pirates trying to take Julius Caesar, and in fact they did take Julius Caesar. And they liked him so much because he was so charismatic and personable that they eventually, I'm summarising the story heavily here, but they eventually, long story short, ended up letting him go, all for him to then turn around with his troops and hunt them down and annihilate them from the face of the earth. A famous story that's for another time. But Roman Navy bringing this peace on the seas, and the Roman engineers and economy bringing all of these road networks. And so you'll see there, it's going to be figure number 1 on your handouts there on page 3. This is a broad map detailing the major highways. Okay, this is just the major highways. This is not the thousands of other roads that then spring forth like a human circulatory system from these highways. Okay, you can see them there in black, obviously on land, running all the way through and around the empire, connecting even to ways that are off. If you go to the far eastern side, you've got roads running all the way through to Babylon. The roads and the major highway down in what is Egypt, runs all the way down through the Upper Nile, all the way down to what today we would call Ethiopia, back then the Kingdom of Axum. All the way up, of course, through and around the Mediterranean, North Africa. There's one running along the coastline of North Africa. If you look closely there to Carthage, it crosses, all the way through to the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain there in the far western side, up through Gaul, which is France, and of course major highway networks through Britain. So this is coming, keep in mind, this is coming at the height of the empire. So this is not specifically like during the reign of Augustus. Britain had not been conquered by that point, for example. But this is the Roman highway system at its height. If I was to show you an actual map of all the roads, I'm saying it would literally look like a human it would look like a human circulatory system, right? It would look like vision of your lungs, just roads, arteries, so to speak, spanning forth off every different direction. And many of these roads are still used in particularly Europe to this day, all throughout. You can travel these roads, a lot of these roads, to this very day. 2,000 years later. You'll see the major naval passageways there, of course, throughout the Mediterranean, as well as over into the Atlantic coastline of Iberia and Gaul and Britain, as well as into the Black Sea up in the northeast. And these major transport avenues, these channels, were now completely protected by the Roman Navy and were constantly patrolled for pirates and bandits and other such things, and were eradicated. And so you had unprecedented world peace on the high seas. Many of these naval channels are the ones that Paul himself took during his missionary journeys, and so you can look at that more closely later on as we work through. And so what we find is this unprecedented economic boom and system that comes because of the infrastructure and the military peace. Okay. It allowed for things that were just literally unthinkable before the rise of Rome. Libya, for example, in North Africa, which is what we call North Africa, was the major grain supplier for, obviously, grain in the city of Rome itself. That was made possible by land transport and particularly naval transport. Meanwhile, the Italian peninsula was able to export its famous wines all over the world. You have examples, of course, of tin and lead and iron from Britain being able to be exported all the way across to Alexandria, Egypt. You have gold and silver from Spain, Hispania as it was called, the Iberian Peninsula, to be able to then be sold at market in Laodicea or in Pergamum or anywhere in Asia Minor. Unheard of, literally inconceivable before the Romans. A global unified economy that was protected and that was thoroughly resourced through infrastructure so that people all around the world could partake of this world economy. And you see on what will be figure 2 there, a kind of more detailed map. And again, I'll leave that for you to go through and look at in more specifics, and you'll be able to then read and see these major highways, before even talking about all the other road networks, but just the major highways and how it connects all these various cities around the world. So that's there in figure 2 specifically. On the note of common economy, and I'll finish this section of the economy on this particular point. It's in this environment that we see the rise of basically the earliest banks of the empire, which were operated in, through, and by the temples. Right, so they didn't have a dedicated bank in the forum or in the street. The temples served as the banking institution, so it was all conducted in the one place. So again, we saw in the emperors the union between the political and the religious when the emperor was called the Pontifex Maximus, right, the chief priest. Here is the unification between the religious and the economic, specifically the banking, right? Because the temple serving as the religious centre of life, which we'll talk more about later, but also served as the centre of banking and commerce in regards to actual specifics of banking. With the construction of temples, they served as basically the perfect outposts of the Roman financial system, which was very, very developed and highly elaborate, particularly compared to anything else from the ancient world, for sure. it allowed for, by having it operate through the temples, in summary here, it allowed for vast expanses of financial transactions to occur across massive distances, obviously in a time before the internet, and it therefore kind of created a system of loaning out more money than you actually have in reserve. And it's in that context that we find the creation of fiat currencies. The parallels between the Roman economy and particularly the late Roman economy, so when Rome is going through decadence and is collapsing by the late 4th century all the way through to its final collapse in the late 5th century, it's because on the economic front, and Rome collapsed for many more reasons just than the economic ones, but on the economic front, Rome basically collapsed because it did everything that the United States and the West is doing right now. It borrowed out exorbitantly higher amounts of money than they actually had in reserve, thereby basically creating a kind of, not literally, but almost like a proto-form of fractional reserve banking. It allowed them to put out legal tender that was not actually backed by the amount of gold or silver they had in stores, so hence now that's the creation of fiat currency, as I mentioned, particularly when it came to transferring money. The Roman banking system allowed for the transference between two economic parties of sums of money far greater and far more larger in sum than what was actually held in account, basically. No parallels between what we're doing today at all. We're quite literally doing the exact same thing that economically ended these guys' empire. Anyway, enough of that pessimistic reality. Nevertheless, that's a simplified version of the Roman economy. I could sit here talking about Roman economics all day. Let's move on to the next section, which is the common language. So, the common language. What we find again, maybe we covered it before, but what we find following the conquest of Alexander the Great is the establishment of Hellenistic culture around the world. Hellenistic referring to that of the Greek culture. As a result, Greek became the common tongue around the world, and particularly in this case, by the time we get to the 1st century, it became the common tongue that united people all around the world. Anyone in the Eastern Empire, right, into the eastern portions of the world, Greek was their language. It was their first language, and that went for many ethnic Jews. In fact, the absolute vast majority of ethnic Jews in the days of the 1st century were speaking Greek as their first primary language. Again, this is why even the more Hebraic New Testament books like Matthew or like the book of Hebrews are still written in Greek. Do you know what I mean? Hebrew was almost exclusively reserved for the temple and for sections of academia. But even then, still it's sections. Hebraic philosophy, so the philosophy of the Hellenistic Jews, that was conducted in Greek. Latin, of course, still obviously played a role in the western provinces of the empire. Obviously, it played a particular role in Rome. Even still, though, right? And so that was particularly the case for politics and law. But when it came to Greek more broadly, even people in the west of the empire, Greek was their second language, and it was the language of commerce. Right, so the language of the merchants, the language of economics and commerce and trade, the language of academia was very much Greek, even in the Western Empire, and Latin was a political language. It was a legal language, but beyond that, even in the West, it was Greek. So if you were obviously in the West and you spoke Latin, the absolute preponderance of them also spoke Greek as the second language. Right? Greek is what unified the world in this time period, and served as the common tongue that unified peoples thousands of kilometres away. And this impacts, as I'm sure you can imagine, plenty of areas of life. It impacts the economics, it impacts the politics, it impacts the religious element, and that's what we then particularly see when it comes to specifically the common culture that are now developed. Again, using culture in a very broad sense here. But the dominant culture in the Roman Empire was not Roman culture, it was Greek. Now, there is a lot of overlap between Greek culture and Roman culture. Hence why we've bothered, especially last week, to understand the origins of Rome and the legendary and mythological context in which Rome arose. And it comes from, as we saw with Aeneas, it comes from a Trojan, and the Trojans were a Hellenic people. They were a Greek people. So there was already a unity that existed in the common kind of cultural conscience between the Greeks and the Romans. But there were decisive differences between Roman culture and Greek culture. But the Greek culture was the predominant culture of the world, and it had been predominant through that Hellenistic period, all the way up until that point when Octavian is declared Augustus by the Roman Senate in 27 BC. One way in which this has been encapsulated is by modern American theologian historian Nick Needham, right, when he said in his work 2,000 Years of Christ's Power, quote, "The armies of Rome vanquished the East, but Eastern culture vanquished Rome." That's a very, very helpful resource, by the way. 2,000 Years of Christ's Power. I think it was originally published in like 1998 off memory, but most bookstores would sell 2016 edition or any of the more recent revisions. It's a series, a 4-set volume that I strongly recommend to any Christian who wants very, obviously accurate historical information and analysis, but without being burdened by the overly academic element. It's very readable, very, very readable, and it does the best job that I've almost pretty much ever seen of bridging the gap between the scholastic or the academic and the kind of common level, right? 2,000 Years of Christ's Power by Nick Needham. Needham spelt on your page there, Needham. Very much worth picking up if you so desire to learn more about these various things of church history. It goes through, just to finish it off, it goes through the early church, it goes through the early medieval church, it then goes through the church of the late medieval period and the Renaissance, and then finishes with the Reformation itself. So it's covering, roughly speaking, the first 1600, 1700 years of the church, approximately. Very, very valuable resource. Nevertheless, by the time we get to that 1st century AD, we now have a setting in which all these things have come to be because of that Greek background. You'll see there in figure number 3, it is on page 5. This here is just an illustration of Athens, of ancient Athens. This is particularly of the Agora, right, or the marketplace on the northern side of the Athenian Acropolis, where the famous Parthenon is, and it's looking up there to the Parthenon. In those days, the famous statue of Athena was still standing there up at the Acropolis in front of the Parthenon, and you can see a lot of the famous Greek architecture there, of course, the pillars, the different archways, the stoa, so on and so forth. If you then compare it to figure number 4, this again is a historical illustration of the northwestern end of the Roman Forum. This is the centre. This is basically the centre of Rome itself. The most popular place. This is the proverbial, George Street or Martin Place of Rome, the Roman Forum. And if you compare those two figures, figure 3 and figure 4, it should not take very long to see the completely common architecture, the pillar structures. Although there were some slight differences, Roman pillars were slightly different than the Greek ones, but built on the same premise. The archways, which you'll notice in Athens, are exclusively triangular, but in Rome. And again, this image is taken from, I believe, probably the 3rd century, looking at the architecture there, because I see the archway of Septimius Severus, which has a rounded archway. The rounded archway is a Roman invention. For whatever reason, the Greeks didn't figure out how to build rounded archways. So rounded archways are a Roman invention. The triangular shapes, which you see not only in Athens but also in Rome, are the Greek element. So comparing figures 3 and 4 there, you should see not only how virtually identical the architecture is, but you'll see, when you look closer in, you'll see that people are dressed the exact same way. The layouts are very same, the steps, the buildings, the construction, the architecture, the statues, the idols, so on and so forth. Rome just looked like another Greek city with other important features to it. This universal architectural design of the cities. And you could go to Alexandria, Egypt, and it looks pretty much the same. You can go to rebuilt Carthage and it looks pretty much the same. You can go to Byzantium, which was the predecessor to Constantinople, or today what we call Istanbul, and it looked pretty much exactly the same. Common culture that spread forth all the way around to the architecture, and not just the architecture, but all facets of cultural life. The language, the education, the philosophy, the science, the arts, the literature, so on and so forth. Greek culture spread all over the world, and it was the culture of the world. Any other cultures that had been conquered or settled or taken over were merely amalgamated into the Greek culture. This, of course, occurred in Egypt, right, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and became the pharaoh of Egypt. The indigenous Egyptian culture, with its pantheon of gods and its customs, and the pharaohs and so on and so forth, just became morphed or merged with the Greek culture to now this hybrid that was still very Greek on the surface and that had the undergirdings of the original indigenous environmental culture. This is the culture that unified the world, and what it brought about with through such commonality, cultural commonalities, it brought about a strong sense of cultural unity and of shared customs that people were now united around the world. We'll move on to one of the most important areas and the final kind of section here, and that is of the next one. That is of the common. Go to the next one. Sorry, I forgot to skip. That is of the common religion. I'll show you there as well. This ties into our religion. It ties into the cultural element. What you have there in figures 5 and 6 are two famous paintings from the 19th century. The 1800s. The first one there that's on screen and that's in figure 5 is what's called Pericles' funeral oration by the German artist Philipp Foltz. A famous painting of a historical event where Pericles, the famous Athenian democratic leader back in the 5th century, so the 400s BC, at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War between the Athenian and the Spartan empires, gave a very famous speech in Athens. You'll see the Acropolis in the background and the Parthenon, and you'll see the way particularly that the Greek people here, the Athenians, are dressed. Togas, the helmets, the colours, everything else. In the next one, which is going to be figure 6, this is another famous painting from the 1800s, the martyrdom of St. Agnes in the Roman Forum, who was, in simple, very short story, a Christian martyr who was martyred in the Roman Forum in front of the Temple of Jupiter in 304 AD. She was a Christian from a noble family, and noble Roman family. She becomes a Christian as a adolescent or as a child, and because she was obviously from a noble family, a noble aristocratic Roman family, she had many suitors, many males who wanted to marry her, of course, by the time she's coming to that marriageable age of 13. But it's in that process that people then find out she's a Christian. She gets outed to the Roman authorities, and she then gets publicly martyred at the age of 13, famously in the Roman Forum. Not sure exactly how. She was most likely beheaded. But that painting is you'll see her kind of in this white or this cream-coloured toga, kneeling down with her head raised in the foreground there, kind of just towards the middle of the bottom of that painting. Her arms are kind of splayed to the side like this, if you can see her there. And there's a man behind with like a green toga holding a sword. That's her. But this is a famous painting of an approximation of what the Roman Forum looked like. It's not exactly correct, but you can see the common architecture and the common way in which the people dressed. This is the same. This is the universal culture of Rome. So it's at this point now that we'll move on to that final section of the common religion. This is particularly where the rubber hits the road for us in regards to church history. This information is what will then carry over quite heavily into the many the opening weeks and months of once we move from the fall of Jerusalem and start getting into the early Christian writings and their interactions with a number of these categories that we're about to talk about right now. So religion, as I'm sure one can probably guess, was absolutely vital and central to Roman life, or life in the Roman Empire. It was absolutely fundamental and essential, not just to the existence of the Roman state, which we'll cover kind of by the end of this section, but particularly just to the lives of everyday people. There was no such thing as life being conducted apart from or without some interaction at some level, in some way, at some point, to the gods. This was the case for the Greeks, this was the case for the Romans, this was the case for everybody. Everything that you had and did was ultimately going to impact your very lives, all the way down to the most specific and minute of details, which we'll cover in detail. What we find is that there are three, which you mentioned this at the top in the introduction, but there are three broad pillars of the Greco-Roman religion which were unified under the Roman Empire into the common world religion of its day. You had the philosophical religions, right? So these were the Greek philosophical schools that arose during the classical period and during the Hellenistic period, more on that in a minute. You had the mystery religions, otherwise known as the mystery cults. And then thirdly, you had the civic religion, which was a combination of traditional, Greco-Roman paganism and the imperial cult, right? So we're going to go through those in succession. Again, we know this from pretty much the most famous Roman scholar, Varro, who was alive in the 1st century BC. And it's him, when he's explaining what theology is, he explains this kind of tripartite or threefold theological or religious system that was ubiquitous all over the world by this particular point, by the time we get to the end of the 1st century. So let's touch first on those philosophical schools. As I mentioned, these come from the classical period of Greece as well as the Hellenistic period. The beginning of the classical period is debated among historians and scholars. I'm going to use one of the more common ones, which is the year 500 BC and the Ionian Revolt. So the revolt of Greek cities along the Turkish coast, what today would be Turkey, against the Persian Empire, which ended up in the Persian invasion of Greece in 492. Nevertheless, the classical period of Greece is essentially 500 BC down to the death of Alexander the Great in 323. So this roughly 200-year period, which was the proverbial golden age of Greece. It's in that time period that, among many other things, the Parthenon was built in Athens. It's where we see the rise of Athenian democracy, the great, basically, war between the Athenian Empire and the Spartan Empire, to use the colloquial terms. They were called the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League, in this great war that went for 30 years, from essentially, roughly speaking, 432 to 400, leading to Sparta's victory, and Sparta being the preeminent empire or city-state in Greece. And then it runs all the way through, as I said, down to the height or the climax of this classical Greek period, which is the great conquests and the triumphs and the glories of Alexander the Great. It's during the classical period that we get the succession of great philosophers that many of you may know: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So they come from the classical period. And then after them, the Hellenistic period begins, after the death of Alexander the Great, and then the Diadochi, right? Those four successor kingdoms. And it's from there that we get a number of other prominent Greek philosophers. By the time you whittle your way down to the 1st century, and the centuries of the Roman Empire, when the church is coming to fruition, we have three broad Greek philosophical systems in terms of the ones that predominate. First, you have Platonism, which originates from Plato, right? So back during the classical period of Greece, late 5th, early 4th century. You have Epicureanism from Epicurus of Samos in the late 4th, early 3rd, as well as his contemporary Zeno of Citium, which is over in Cyprus, who formed Stoicism, which again at the same time late 4th, early 3rd. Those work their way through the Hellenistic period. They become developed, they become very popular, widely popular, all throughout the empire in different ways. Epicureanism and Stoicism were kind of breakaways from Platonism. So Epicurus kind of rejected some of the fundamental principles of Platonic philosophy, but without delving into a philosophical historical lesson, we get this as deeply, deeply, deeply influential by the time we get to the first century. We encounter the Epicureans and the Stoics in Acts chapter 17. Right, when Paul, the Apostle Paul, is giving one of his most famous speeches, if not his most famous speech, at the Areopagus in Athens, right near where that photo was back in figure, I think it was figure 3, and in fact it is literally where in figure 5 Pericles is standing. Right, so Pericles in the red and white toga with the helmet there and the plumes of back in figure 5 on page 6, that is the Areopagus. That is where Paul gave his famous speech in Acts chapter 17. Okay, otherwise known as Mars Hill, just by the side of the Acropolis. He encounters, as in the Apostle Paul, encounters the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who would commonly meet at the Areopagus in Athens. And more on, again, what these people believe is what we'll then touch on when we get through to those early centuries of the church, because many of the early church fathers were converts out of the Greek philosophical systems themselves. And so more on the actual specifics of those details. But in summary, the philosophy of the Roman Empire, right, and the philosophies that existed in those days was not like we have today, where it's basically just like an academic subject kind of to be studied, right, at school or university. Philosophy was a way of life. It was in itself, or in its own right, its own religious system. Does that make sense? Yeah. It was a way of living. It was a way of life. That's why there's kind of been this resurgence of Stoicism in the modern day, because people, some are, particularly young men, are kind of sick and tired of the hedonism and the postmodernism and the rubbish, and they go looking for something and they land on Stoicism because, in simplified terms, Stoicism, among other things, teaches discipline, self-control, being objective, things that are inherent to Stoic philosophy. It's a way of living, right? And that very system formed one's worldview, right? How you actually literally viewed the world around you. Philosophers and their students almost exclusively came from kind of the educated upper classes. So this was not a poor man's religion, so to speak. These systems of philosophy, they were very much overwhelmingly for the educated upper class. But nonetheless, it's important, and we'll get onto those as we go through those early centuries, because I mentioned a number of the early church fathers were converts out of particularly Platonism, right? What was by that point either Middle Platonism or Neoplatonism, which just means New Platonism. And so it's important that we understand that. It informs our reading of the Gospels and of particularly the epistles. Again, Colossians was written, this is a summary, but Colossians was written by the Apostle Paul to the church of Colossae because they were dealing with Gnostic heretics. Gnostic heretics were taking Greek Platonic philosophy and unifying it or merging it with the teachings of Christ to produce heresies. Okay? So that philosophical element, Greek philosophy, is the earliest enemy of the church, right alongside the Judaizers of Galatia particularly. Okay? But the Greek philosophy ties in super heavily, so we'll cover that as we kind of go through. The second portion of this is the mystery cults, right? Sounds ominous, the mystery cults. That's what they're referred to. Mystery in this sense referring not to like being unknown, but mystery referring specifically to secret knowledge, right? Referring to the fact that specifically, in summary, their practices were secret to outsiders. Okay? They were functionally speaking almost like secret societies. Not secret in the fact that people didn't know they existed, everyone knew they existed, but the teachings of the mystery cults and the practices, how you actually progressed through them, all those kinds of things were secret, right? So they're the mystery cults. They also then were, more importantly, this is where the word mystery comes from, they were also teaching the mysterion, or the mysteries of the gods. Okay, they were much newer in origin than Roman paganism. A lot of the mystery cults that existed weren't even around by the time Christ was born. They actually come from the first century itself. And that includes a number of them. Again, some of the three famous ones were the cult of Cybele, or the Cybele in Asia Minor particularly. So this was popular in a number of those cities like Ephesus and Pergamum and so on and so forth. The cult of Isis in Egypt was another famous one that was tied more to that Egyptian mythology. And then easily the most famous of them in terms of at least volume of adherents was the cult of Mithras, known as Mithraism. Mithras was originally a Persian deity of a number of things: light, oaths, covenants, etc., other complex things which aren't this morning's or this evening's point. But nevertheless, it had worked its way all the way across to Rome, where it had become particularly popular in the Western Empire and specifically Rome itself. It was the number one religious practice of the Roman army. Okay? So the Roman soldiers overwhelmingly were part of the cult of Mithras. Right? They were Mithraists. It was a very secretive mystery cult. They met basically in what we would kind of refer to as dungeons practically. And it had a series of 7 different levels that you would be initiated into and progress through. It had a sacrificial meal tied to each level, and that's the reason why we know a lot about Mithraism is because the early Christian theologians and historians spent a lot of time trying to combat Mithraism, because they basically had developed this kind of basically like mock counterpart to the Lord's Supper. And so a lot of writing of the early Christian theologians is combating the false Eucharist of the Mithraists. It was probably attractive to the Roman soldiers because it had a very tightly controlled structure, and it had different ranks and levels as you worked your way through the 7 levels. So it was a lot like the Roman military. It had a strong sense of brotherhood, of unity in the secret cult of Mithras, right? This is why these things were popular. This is the mystery cult. Now, it's at this point that we move to kind of what we tend to think of when we think of Roman religion, which is the civic religion, divided into 2 parts that were unified. Traditional paganism, okay, so the gods and what we typically think of in common parlance, and the imperial cult. So we're going to go through in that order. What's worth pointing out here, and we'll touch on it more in a bit, is none of these things are incompatible with each other. In fact, they are explicitly and overtly designed to be very much compatible with each other. I mentioned earlier when it came to the banking on the economic side, the temples were the centre point of civic life, and particularly that of religious life. They served as the centre point of daily religious life around the world in the empire. Traditional paganism, as this portion of the civic religion, it constituted the worship of the family of gods, which they were, headed by the king of the gods, known to the Greeks as Zeus, known to the Romans as Jupiter, or Jove, but Jupiter mainly. And then you had different gods that were part of this family that were responsible for all manners of, different parts of life. You had, Ares to the Greeks, known as Mars to the Romans, who was the god of war. You would have Aphrodite to the Greeks, known as Venus to the Romans, who was the goddess of, among other things, love. Artemis to the Greeks, known as Diana to the Romans, the goddess of, among other things, nature and wildlife. You're going out on a hunt, you're going out to take down a deer to have food for the family or for your marketplace, you're a butcher, whatever, you better make sure that you provide a sacrifice to Artemis before you go out. If you have to cross a dangerous river to get to wherever you're going to hunt, you better make sure that you make offerings, sacred offerings, to the various nymphs and other such deities that control nature. All these kinds of things. If you have to travel with your products, right, you're selling, pick anything, lead, over in another city, and you've got to travel across the seas, well, you had better make sacrifice to Poseidon, right, known as Neptune. You have to make these sacrifices, and you have to constantly engage in a never-ending list of appeasing the gods and seeking their blessing for all manners of things in your daily civic life. This was a vital component of what it meant to actually be an upholder of religious virtue. It was a constant system of animal sacrifice, of prayers, of rituals, of consulting the oracles. They used to say that the prophets or the prophetesses, seeking their wisdom and their blessing and their insight from the gods as to, all manner of minute things. Constant system that was tied intimately and intricately to everything. Hopefully thus far you should have been able to see how interconnected all of this is. The politics, intimately connected to the religious element, which is intimately connected to the economics, which is intimately connected to the language and the art. All of it's just this gigantic, morphed, unified world system that was all tied and had crossover and overflow to all manners of different areas of life. Again, this traditional paganism was considered on paper, the official religion of the empire. It was funded by the state, it was upheld by the state, it was legislatively controlled and maintained by the state because of the perfect unification and crossover between the state and religion itself. And this traditional paganism, this civic religion of Rome, was considered vital to the very existence of the Roman state. And so it was to be protected and maintained at all costs. We find, as I mentioned earlier, that it's intimately tied to that aspects of culture that I mentioned earlier. And of course, we've seen thus far, again, the Roman emperor himself was indeed held the position and title of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest himself. So, now onto the imperial cult itself. And this is where we start to see the kind of big move in towards the actual dealings of how the emperor was viewed and upheld and what was expected of him. So you'll find there on page 8 of your study notes. The word cult, from the Latin cultus, what it does is it speaks to basically the way in which the emperors were divinely sanctioned as the authority of the Roman state, right? And that carried with it another title which we didn't cover earlier, right? But the auctoritas, right? Which means self-rule. It's where we get the word autocracy from, for example. The emperors were divinely sanctioned. They were installed by the express will and blessing of the gods, right? And of course, as we saw last week particularly, this is tied intimately to the fact that the emperors were practically divine in and of themselves. They were literally descendants of the gods in more than one way, because they were descended from Julius Caesar by adoption mainly, and by mainly I mean exclusively. And Julius Caesar himself was both a descendant of Mars, was a descendant of Venus, going all the way back through to Aeneas, who himself was a demigod, whose mother was Venus, and as well as the fact that he himself was the embodiment of the Roman state, and the city of Rome itself was founded by Romulus and Remus, whose father was Mars. Mars, the husband of Venus. It's now this perfect unity between Mars and Venus, all the way down through Romulus and Remus as like the civic component, but then genetically and specifically, ancestrally to Julius Caesar, right? All perfectly tied with history and this wonderful propagandistic portrayal of how things in fact were. He was also held as princeps, which we covered earlier, and as princeps, as the prince, as the first citizen of Rome, the greatest citizen of Rome in essence, the emperor was expected to maintain peace, prosperity and harmony between particularly the Roman military and the Senate and people of Rome. Right? So again, that whole Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, that was what the system of Rome was. Right? This unity between the military and between the Senate and people, right? Which sometimes worked, sometimes very much did not. I mentioned earlier in previous weeks that approximately half of the Roman emperors that ever were assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, which was the elite imperial guard of the Roman army, okay, on political grounds. Because I'm saying to you, the military, and particularly the Praetorian Guard, was its own political beast in and of itself. The emperor's office and rule were divinely approved. This is what I mean by the cultus. And it came, therefore, with particular religious and moral expectations. An emperor who was living, right? So that current sitting emperor was expected to be, especially as princeps, the first or the greatest citizen, the greatest example of what it meant to be a Roman. He was expected to be the preeminent example of pietas, right? Which is where we get the word piety from, right? Religious service, religious devotion. So he was expected to be the most obvious example of worship of the gods and the most obvious example of religious devotion. But in, through, and because of that, because he was held by standards of the Senate and so on to be the greatest example of piety, religious devotion and duty and service, he himself was then to be accorded due honour and veneration and reverence for his position as Pontifex Maximus and his position of being the greatest example of piety. Without being smart, this is not terribly... Say that again? Up the back there, who's uttering the word that I'm about to utter? Yeah. Yes, right. This is not terribly dissimilar to where the bishopric of Rome has now descended. It was not always originally that way, but it's developed that way slowly, progressively and surely over the last 1,000 years. A deceased emperor, on the other hand, as I mentioned way back at the beginning, but covering it here now, again, a deceased emperor was able or was eligible to be declared, divus or divius, right, to be divine from the Latin. And this was a declaration by the Senate, right? And it was done so through undergoing what's called apotheosis, which just simply means deification. So this is what happened to Julius Caesar, okay? That's where this divine entanglement with the emperors themselves comes from, okay? Julius Caesar was deified after his death posthumously. Therefore, now Augustus, his adopted son and full legal heir, was now the son of a god. Okay? And he was not only portrayed as such, he was referred as such. And so I'll finish with these examples that we see end of page 8 and also page 9. If you have looked at figure 7, this one, at figure 9, I should say, actually do that first off. You have the Roman aureus, which is simply the gold coin of Rome. What you have there, this was minted approximately, we think, about AD 13, so kind of the last year of the reign of Augustus before his death in AD 14. You have there obviously the icon or the image of Caesar Augustus. They're portrayed in regal attire. He also has, it might not be easy to make out amidst his hair, but he's also wearing a laurel wreath that comes up around his head, and you can see where it's tied off at the back behind his head. That's not a rat's tail, that's the laurel wreath being tied off. If you look down at the bottom of his neck, so the bottom right, roughly speaking, it runs up the side, Caesar Augustus, right? Caesar Augustus, so his imperial title, and then it continues round at the kind of top of his head, Divi F for Filius, Pater Patria. Okay, so Divi Filius, son of the divine or son of God, Pater Patria, father of the fatherland. This is a resolute designation of not only him being the great or the venerable, Caesar Augustus. He is Divi Filius, the son of a god, which extends divine connotations to him. He's also the father of the fatherland, right? He's the source of what it means to be Roman. Right? Do you see how all these kind of categorizations inform not only how the emperors were viewed, but by extension, again, the Roman emperors were the embodiment of Rome. This is how the people of the world viewed Rome and the Roman Empire and the world in which they lived. It's interesting to compare that to this other example we have here. This is figure 8, going backwards. This is a Roman denarius. You'll be familiar with denarius or denarii from the Gospels particularly. This was the more basic or common denomination. And aureus was at different points in time, roughly speaking, because obviously inflation occurs. And inflation occurs when you create fiat currency, which is what the Romans did. But an aureus was approximately about 25 times the value by the first century, roughly, we think, of a denarius. And a denarius was basically a day's wage, approximately speaking, for the average punter. This was minted earlier in Augustus's reign, back, kind of in the end of the first third, roughly, of his reign, right? In what we think is about 18 BC. You have a similar concept there, again, on the front side. You have the icon or the image of Caesar Augustus. It says there Caesar on the left, Augustus on the right. But then on the flip side, and this was kind of a not necessarily a special edition coin, but you can kind of think of it that way. In one sense, this is what's called the Julian Star coin that was minted and then published. What you have there on the right side is, it again says that a similar phrase. On the left, divus, which is that divine, and then Julius, so divine Julius, right? Because Julius Caesar had been deified by this point. Okay. What you then have, and what you might be wondering, what are these kind of rays sparking off? This comes from one of the most convenient and helpful pieces of propaganda material in the history of the world. This is what's called the Julian Star, or the Star of Caesar, or Caesar's Comet. Julius Caesar dies on, I believe, March 15th, 44 BC. Yes, March 15th rather. March 15th, 44 BC. He dies, funeral rites, the whole box and dice, greatly esteemed. Again, he was assassinated by a traitor, etc., etc., etc. A couple of months later, in July, over Rome and that part of the Mediterranean world, there's a bright, very obvious, very widely seen meteor shower, okay, of these 8 comets that came across the horizon during the extended funeral celebrations by the Senate for Julius Caesar. This was taken by Octavian, who we call Augustus, and by extension the Roman Senate, as bona fide evidence of Julius Caesar having been deified and accepted into the pantheon of the gods. Okay? Because it occurred right around when he died, during the funeral celebrations in Rome. Okay? And so Caesar's comet, or the Star of Julius, the Star of Caesar, the Julian Star, became a famous piece of evidence in Rome that everyone knew, all around the world, that Julius Caesar had indeed been deified, and this was the sign in the heavens from the gods that he had ascended to the status of a god. And so that's what features there, is you've got this flame, and that dot in the middle is this comet and the rays coming from the comet. Okay? This is what it means for these emperors to have been viewed in this particular fashion. And then lastly, and we'll finish on this one, this is then figure 7 on page 8. This is one of many statues of Augustus. We saw one last week, or in the last lesson particularly, of Augustus at Prima Porta, dressed in this divine militaristic outfit, hailing to his heritage from Venus. This here is another one which is even arguably more on the nose, but just as much as Augustus at Prima Porta. This is the statue of Augustus as Jupiter. So here, Caesar Augustus is portrayed enthroned like Jupiter, the king of the gods. He's dressed exactly like Jupiter. He's sitting just like Jupiter was often portrayed, and he has in his left hand, this is an insert in the museum in Russia where this is held, what was originally a scepter, right? It's not there now, but they've inserted one to show what it was like. Holding a scepter, which is obviously a scepter which you're probably familiar with from the scripture, right? The scepter is a symbol of kingly authority, of monarchical authority. Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. The scepter has, for thousands of years, been a symbol of royal authority. And here, a scepter being held for someone who was supposedly not a king. In his right hand, though, and this is the cherry on top for all of that we've looked at thus far. In his right hand is a globus. A globus is where we get the English word globe from. This is symbolizing explicitly and overtly and evidently to everyone who saw this and to everyone who's ever seen this, the emperor holds the world in his hand. He holds the world, he controls the world, he rules the world. and he runs the world. That's the clear symbology of the globus being held in the hand. It's why medieval monarchs, like what Paul did in the epistles, took this and flipped it on its head, and Christian monarchs, instead of holding the world in their hand like, oh, I'm the greatest, I'm the king of the world, I rule the world, which is exactly what the emperors thought of themselves and what everyone thought of the emperors. They then had a globus, but it had a cross on top of it, and a cross that then spread out throughout the world, symbolising the fact that Christ rules the world, not the king. That's a fascinating piece of medieval Christian, working and artwork there. So I'll leave you on that image, which so clearly portrays the universal reign, the universal rule, the divine image of the emperors, and by extension, this governmental system, which was in its own time and its stage was the one world government, and it was the culture that ruled the world under the head of this one man who held the world figuratively in his hands. So therein we end our lesson. That gives you a good background for then how we then understand these things, and there'll be cross references to it, of course, no shortage of times as we work our way through and go through. This is as condensed as I could make this information for this afternoon, and so again you'll be able to go over it. It'll be helpful in weeks future and months future to, if we come across a piece of information, every now and then I might say, hey, go back and watch lesson 4. Just remind yourself of what this aspect of the economy meant, or what this aspect of the mystery cults meant, things like that. So there will be points where that will come up all the time in regards to the details we've looked at this afternoon. So, any comments or questions? Yes?
I think I've noticed through all of this that all through the cultures and history that man has this innate need to find a higher power.
An innate need to find a higher power, yes.
So do we think God has genetically created us
Correct.
in that way to...
Yes, it's evidence and testimony of the spiritual nature of mankind. Yes, exactly. It's evidence, it's blindingly obvious evidence of the spiritual nature of mankind, of the fact that even the most grotesque of pagans throughout history would laugh, mock and scorn the concept of atheism. That atheism, well, and that's not an opinion, like atheism was illegal in Rome. It was a charge that was commonly brought against the early Christians because they denied that the Roman pantheon existed. So they were commonly charged with atheism. There's no shortage of martyrs that we will be united with one day who died and were put to death by the state for the explicit charge of atheism, because they denied the Roman gods and they said they're not real, there is only one God, right? Which is the consistent, the motto of God's people, ancient and modern, Shema Yisrael Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is one, Yahweh is our God. Yeah, that's the motto. There's one God. So, yes, exactly. So, yes.
No wonder Herod.
Say again?
No wonder Herod was a little bit concerned with the white men still turned up and said, we saw the star of the...
Yeah. Yes, this is exactly why Herod wet himself when these pagan magicians from Persia rolled up saying, we've seen the sign of that we've read of throughout the ancient literatures, referencing the scriptures, of the birth of the Messiah, of the King of the Jews. So do you want to take us to him? And excuse me? That's exactly why, yes. Because the rule and reign and the kingdom of Christ is the primordial, the primeval, and the primary threat to the rulership and the imperiums, so to speak, of man. Yep. All right, you had a question? Any question or comment?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, while you've been speaking, that what has come to me with the pride and the power and everything that you've been talking about, the true and living God became a baby.
Yes.
And I mean, it's just remarkable that he is is the only true God, and that's how he presented himself to man who was under all those other gods.
Correct, yes, exactly, yes. The incarnation and Christ coming as, born of the flesh, born of his mother, that is to say, undergoing the exact same, biological development that we all went through in utero, right? And then being born as a baby, and everything else that's entailed with the baby. Again, there's no reason to think that it wasn't the same. There's no reason to think that he came out and gave this great Socratic speech when he was born. No, he was born and he cried and he needed mother's milk and he needed everything else. He needed caring for all the things. It's the incarnation and the reality of that, other than the theological necessities that we've explained, the fact that gospel is impossible without the incarnation, was also at the same time, part of that was indeed this very, very obvious and overt declaration that instead of the elevation of man to these, literally divine imperious heights, this is the actual one who is divine, the one who actually is the ruler of the world, the one who actually is above all things and all men, choosing to humble himself as the infinite and divine God and adopt human flesh, and then becoming just like his creation. It's the very antithesis of exactly what the entire pagan system was. Yeah.